Bueno, el ponente que tenemos hoy es un ponente de excepción, lo conocemos todos, yo creo que necesita presentación. Ehtisham Ahmad, que nos va a hablar un poquito de, bueno, de cómo los gobiernos a diferentes niveles afrontan shocks o crisis importantes y cómo eso mejora su capacidad de adaptación, ¿no? Su capacidad de recuperación. Entonces, bueno, como os decía, no necesita presentación, es miembro honorario de nuestra asociación, de AIFIL, y bueno, ha estado en instituciones de tanto prestigio como la London School of Economics o el Fondo Monetario Internacional, ¿no? Y bueno, sin más, creo que Ehtisham va a hablar en inglés, a pesar de que entiende perfectamente el castellano, pero yo creo que va a hacer su presentación en inglés. Bueno, thank you very much, Ehtisham, to accept our invitation to present your research and your ideas in this seminar. And yeah, I would like just to try to fit the time we have for the presentations is around 35-40 minutes maximum, because after we will discuss with the audience, with people attending to the seminar, so that would be great. And that's it. Thank you again, and the audience is now yours. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. It's a great pleasure to speak to you. I guess my first AIFIL presentation, I guess, since joining the board. I'm talking to you about, critical issues facing the world economy, but also Latin America in particular. And the important issue is that this is an inflection point that requires rethinking theory and policy advice. And it's one of the major inflection points that, we have seen, in the last 40 years. I guess the others would have been the crisis in 2008-10, and prior to that, the fall of the Soviet Union. I won't go into the historical transformation, particularly of the theory of multi-level finance, although, as you know, both the normative and positive approaches have evolved during this particular 30 years or so. I think there's a need to rethink again both theory and policies at this stage. So looking at climate shocks, health shocks, there's breaks in value chains, and also what you're seeing now is a tightening in monetary policies in the G7 countries. And that's going to have a major impact on Latin America. Already you can see what's happening in Colombia. It's a canary in the coal mine. What's essential from the analytic point of view is the importance of bringing into play the role of uncertainty. So you cannot assume that there is a steady state to which economies revert. And that affects, for example, the design of subnational fiscal rules, but also how various policies, revenue assignments, spending assignments come together. I'm going to talk very much about the inadequacy of the normative market-based solutions and libertarian US-centric policies, which were popularized particularly in the 1990s following the fall of the Soviet Union, especially by the international agencies. And you've seen in Chile as the example of market-based approach with some success, but also with some problems. And we'll talk a little bit about the Chilean problems. The spatial dynamics of structural change is of growing importance, and really it's applications of geographical federalism, which is important, which Revelli and others have been working on. And on the one hand, you have various degrees of electoral competition or yardstick competition. And on the other hand, you also have administrative progression models completely different governance models for example, in East Asia and China and also in South Asia. And one needs to, again, look at how global support is needed and can be implemented efficiently. And there are lessons from the HIPC programs. So what one is looking at is the role of national, regional, local policies and less volatile spending of basic services, but also anchoring access to private finance. So you have national taxes for efficient revenue generation and reducing costs of doing business. You've got national taxes, which form the basis for subnational taxes. Then you've got a whole discussion on beneficial property taxes, which have been slow to be implemented. This idea goes back to Alfred Marshall from the 1890s, which Giorgio Brosio and I have just finished writing a book on, which we will probably discuss at a later stage in an AIFIL seminar. But really, I'd like to talk a little bit about one example, which is work with Hernan Vizcarra on Mexico. There's also work on China, but I'll concentrate largely on Latin America in this presentation. So really also one needs a much tighter focus on the governance framework relating to national financial transactions, but also earmark transfers from cross-border, from regional entities, from international agencies, to address the most vulnerable and people who are affected. And here there's a need for a much stronger emphasis on a clear delineation of balance sheets, which is really liabilities, wages, operations, which is the GFSM framework, but also it's GFSM plus, because it involves identifying separately transfers which come from other agencies and levels of government. So these are issues which I think are important. I'll go through them in various degrees of emphasis. So the short term, as I said, you've got pandemic result, you've got conflict affecting food and price, food and energy prices. You've got breakdown in global value chains and tightening of credit in G7 countries, with a knock-on effect, particularly on Latin America. And in the longer run, you've got uncertainties increasing, more frequent droughts, fires, floods, hurricanes, particularly in the Caribbean. The important point is that you cannot assume that the world will return to a steady state, and this affects the design of fiscal rules. As you know, the European Union is reconsidering its fiscal rules. There should be an announcement in the next week or so. But also a lot of other public policies that assume that there is a steady state which operates. But really problematic is the focus on numerical fiscal rules at the subnational level, which, despite the discussion of climate change, for example, by Georgieva and the IMF staff are still emphasizing the role of subnational numerical fiscal rules, which I think has a problem in an uncertain world. And it also, of course, increases inequality in lagging regions. So really, enhanced resilience must address risk and uncertainty. You need to be looking at economic shocks, but also social impacts, and of course, the fiscal and financial measures that cut across all of these issues. And coordinated actions would be necessary from higher levels of government, but also actions at the local level. Particularly important are informal sector and the vulnerable, but also the fixed income urban middle classes. The rich tend to be well hedged, but they're not completely immune to health risks. And the problems have been that the increasing migrations to large metropolitan areas, leading to urban sprawl in Mexico City or Santiago de Chile, or you've got Mumbai, Lagos, Jakarta, really has been hugely problematic. Mexico City and Jakarta are sinking and really can't take more people. But also these communities and these people are subject to increased health risks and also to climate risks. And political sustainability requires maintenance of public services, and basic preconditions for a just transition include the maintenance of basic services and support for the informal sector. So a coordinated approach to addressing these changes is necessary, and people have, my colleague Nick Stern has focused correctly, in my view, on public investment. And public investment decisions must be based on appropriate weight on human, natural, social capital, but also the impact on households in different parts of the country, particularly in backward regions. It must also include an appropriate discount rate, which is going back to Stiglitz and Stern's work, and minimizing fiscal risks at different levels of government. So that's the overall investment criteria. And these weights on the investment design need to be reflected also on tax design. And that's terribly important because these decisions are in international agencies done separately. So really the shadow prices you use for investment should be used also in determining the directions of reform, extensions of the theory of reform, optimal taxation theory. And those are necessary at different levels of government to drive structural change and incentives for adaptation. So really what one is looking at in individual countries is a strategy for long-term growth and provision of basic services and infrastructure, but also having the ability of different levels of government to anchor access to private services, private capital. So really you need national coordinations, proper information and governance, and the spatial dimensions are particularly important. The local own source revenues are essential in ensuring access to private credit, access to bonds, access to PPPs. This is work that Ambrosiano and Bordigno and the handbook with Giorgio Ambrosio in 2015, also Teresa Terminacion in a book on the Euro crisis. So full information on transaction and buildup of liabilities is essential. But that's not available in a large part of the emerging market world. So the key issue in large metropolitan areas is also making sure that you do not continue to attract more people into Mexico City or Jakarta or Santiago. And therefore looking at compact, clean and connected employment hubs outside the metropolitan area is a key element in an adaptation story. So really you're looking at a coordinated strategy where you have decisions on investment and taxation, which are coordinated at the national, regional and local level with the appropriate public services and local infrastructure. So it's sort of a symbiotic coordination of policies across levels of government if you're to achieve sustainable and resilient development. So private sector financing, on which there's a lot of emphasis, including on COP27, is that it's important, but you cannot only rely on the private sector finance. So if you do, you end up with increased inequalities, and then the spatial dynamics of migration and urban structural reform lead to concentration in metropolitan areas with pollution and congestion, and including also increasing fiscal stress. Now, of course, really the EC next generation focuses on bringing activities outside the major areas. UK's leveling up is mired in confusion because it's still relying on the private sector to achieve this rebalancing, which is actually very difficult to do. And the government of Liz Truss tried to create Singapore on Thames, which is really the opposite of leveling up, But that's what's been happening in the UK. So, or the Chinese case also, there's a huge concentration of activities along the coast. It's very interesting to look at what happened in the UK, which is the paragon or private sector financing of infrastructure. If you look at where all of it has gone, it's in London. If you look at the per capita income of London relative to the last column on the right-hand side of this graph, and you can understand why there's so much disenchantment in the North, the Midwest, and the West. So really, the inequalities in the UK are greater than in any other European country. And of course, that's contributed to some extent to the Brexit debate. China, the revenue centralization created problems for financing local infrastructure. But there again, you know, the advice given to China by some international agencies was to rely on land value capture, which is also advice given to many Latin American countries. Consequences has been build-up of enormous liabilities at the local level, lack of one-source revenues, huge hidden liabilities, urban sprawl, congestion, pollution, and establishing a local government bond system without a local government tax system has been hugely problematic and has done nothing to solve the really major problem of the enhanced leverage at the local level. But what it has done is attract over 500 million people in 20 years to the coastal areas. Of course, there have been major reductions in poverty, but the urban areas along the coast are now much too big. So the new development strategies to rely much more on domestic consumption, also activities which are much closer to the population centers and move people out of the major metropolitan areas. So really you have major problems in the coastal areas. So where should the investment go? And the IMF in 2020, book by Schwartz, it all correctly focuses on clean investment, efficient investment. And, you know, the poster girl for the IMF in 2020 and was Chile. The latest public investment handbook also basically focuses on market-based efficiency, numerical fiscal rules, and transfers to people who are affected. Now, the Chilean example is a very good one, because what it shows is that the Sistema Nacional de Inversiones provides for transparency and coordination, but the market-based approach to pricing and the use of LIBOR plus discount rates leads to investments that are concentrated in the Zona Metropolitana. And it just creates incentives for people to move into the Zona Metropolitana. North-South highway makes it easier for them to do so. And the allocation of funds for people who are affected, single mother households, the poor in the sprawling suburbs, etc. Basically, you have more money and more transfer to the Zona Metropolitana. So what you have in Chile over a 30-year period is declining economic complexity, given the Harvard MIT indices, with fewer domestic linkages and job creation, which is really concentrated only in a few sectors. So this is an example of where the transfers, the FNDR allocations go, and it's largely because the allocations to indigenous, etc., which are actually now moving into the Zona Metropolitana. So the spatial dynamics changes where the transfers go, and in a sense, what you have is generalization of Santiago Levy's famous phrase, "Good intentions, bad outcomes," which we use for financing, social security by payroll taxation. Now, the Mexican 2013 reforms, which I had the opportunity to contribute to, focus very much on the VAT as creating a base for investment and blocking holes and blocking special provisions that pushed investment into the maquiladora zone. It created a level playing field in and wherever there was connectivity. There was also a carbon tax, which was introduced in Mexico. So the effect of the Mexican reforms was to make particularly the connected areas an economic zone. So if you look at the direction of automobile investment and automobile-related investment, it's all over the country, except in the south. So you have increasing inequalities in Mexico. So work again with Hernan Vizcarra. We were looking at state at club convergence, and really the South falls way behind, with Mexico City and surroundings as being sort of in a club of its own. And this is reflecting the disparities in provision of basic services. So if you're thinking of investment in the South, you need to have not just connectivity, but you also need basic services. So there's a huge push that's necessary for attracting both workers and firms. So what you need to do is to move people out of Mexico City. There are far too many people there. They're now no longer in Mexico City because of the restructuring. They're in the suburbs, in the Estado de Mexico. But they're there, and they're still there, and they're drawing out water, and the city continues to sink. So inequality in Mexico was addressed, since the 1990s with the Oportunidades Progresa program, the conditional cash transfer, generalized by the World Bank all over the world. But it did nothing to reduce poverty in Chiapas. Poverty actually went up. The program was abandoned by the current administration, which is, as you know, it's very concerned with the effects on the poor. The point is that if you're looking to address spatial inequalities, you can't do it just by giving cash transfers. It has to be as a result of basic services and public investment and creation of jobs. So how does one manage the risks and shocks which are affecting both livelihoods, infrastructure, and jobs? So really the standard numerical fiscal rules are based on the assumption that you have a perturbation and then you get back to the steady state. That doesn't happen if you are in an uncertain world. There is no steady state. And the preconditions for subnational fiscal rules, which Teresa Terminacion nicely pointed out, were you need own source revenues and full transparency on the operations at the subnational level, which is very hard to achieve in a large part of Latin America. And if you just apply numerical fiscal rules across the board, then you can actually just accentuate spatial inequalities. And then also, when you have the transfers from the international community, the HIPIC program, which I looked at for Bolivia with George Ambrosio, for example, was actually not very effective in providing support for basic public services, even though the HIPIC 2 was designed to give monies to municipalities for education and health. The problem was that Bolivian municipalities had no control over wages, hiring of teachers or doctors, or investments. If you just focus on the functional responsibility, you need to make sure that you look also at the economic components of each function. And unfortunately, given the way that the IFMISs and CIAFES had been set up, you couldn't do that in Bolivia and a large part of Latin America either, for that matter. So if you're looking at the special purpose transfers, again, with the new resilience facility, which the IMF has just set up, you need to avoid the mistakes of HIPIC 2. So if you are providing financing for education and health to Bolivian municipalities or municipalities in Colombia or Peru, you need to make sure that you have the full information on the matrix, which is that, let me come to the economic components, which is wages, hiring, firing decisions, use of goods and services, fixed capital, non-financial assets, and then you've got programs and outcomes. So if you're looking at the outcomes of any particular sector, for example, primary education or basic healthcare, it has to be in relation not just to the function, but also to components of the function, which means that you need to be looking at the full matrix. The full matrix, by the way, is an example of a chart of accounts, which is compatible with the GFSM components. So the rows along the top are the economic categories of the balance sheet, and the columns on the left are the functions. So if all you do is put greater tagging along the columns, particularly the left column, which is what a number of international agencies are doing, without looking at the rows, then you're going to miss the point. The point is that achieving a sustainable outcome, basic education and primary healthcare, requires information and management of teachers, wages, inputs, medicines, etc., and investment, and also managing the liabilities. So really you need the matrix. And unfortunately, a number of international agencies are just tagging the first column, which is not wrong, but it is misleading. And it just adds to complexity, which will be very hard to manage in the long run. So really a better design of special programs, special purpose programs is needed, along with the incentives facing local governments. Now, incentives facing local governments are generated in two ways. One is having the full information, which I just discussed, which is not just tagging the functions, but also the components, but also in incentives in terms of if you have elections, or even if you don't, you need to make sure that a local government bears responsibilities for accessing transfers or accessing private finance. And that's where the own source revenue comes in. And this is a book that we will talk to at some later stage, hopefully with George Ambrosio. It's local taxation for accountable and sustainable access to private finance. It's essential in looking at a sustainable growth strategy over the medium term. So what's actually happened is that you need own source revenues, not just to finance the local services, but also open up doors to municipal bonds, PPPs, and other forms of private credit. And of course, you know, what you see now is the importance of modern technology, blockchain, big data, which completely transforms the possibilities. So really what we are suggesting is that one needs to relook at the US model, which has been implemented unsuccessfully throughout Latin America and Asia and Africa, has not generated revenues, but leaves the entire sustainable development and response to crisis strategy in tatters, because you have no local anchor. So really what one needs is more equitable, stable local finance for the sustainable employment hubs I spoke about, not just in Mexico City, but in Chiapas. And the work we did, simulation work with Hernan Vizcarra for Mexico, I'll talk about that from a sustainability perspective. It's important because it's attractive from a political accountability story. It can be made progressive. It can raise almost 1.5 to 2% of GDP, whereas at the moment in Mexico, you raise less than 0.2 of 1% of GDP. It's almost 10 times as much revenue can be raised, and quickly, without the political economy constraints which face the traditional ownership valuation type property taxes. But it means that you need to be looking at the design of intergovernmental fiscal transfers, both the equalization framework and the special purpose transfers, which we just discussed. So just taking a flat per square meter tax to generate 1.5% of state revenue, 1.5% of state GDP, you find that Chiapas would have a tax rate of 87 pesos per square meter, whereas in Ciudad de Mexico, it would be 437. So that by itself creates incentives for people and firms to move out of Ciudad de Mexico. And of course, you would have greater differentiation by location and by size of property. So this is just a very rough example. Estimates of Atkinson indices with the beneficial property tax calibrated to raise 1.5 percentage points of state GDP. And you find that even just the imposition of the beneficial property tax without the linkage to public services is inequality reducing. And if you do make the linkage, it's very strongly redistributive. And the linkage actually provides the political economy link between benefits and taxes that was the core of the beneficial property proposal by Marshall over 100 years ago. But what you need to then do is to also redo the participaciones, which is the equivalent of the fiscal equalization, but also then to think about the special purpose programs, the aportaciones. So we got similar results in the Chinese case, which I will not have time to go into, but just to say that the US-type property taxation experiments, which were supported by the World Bank in Shanghai and Chongqing, failed to raise any revenues, largely because of fixed income people in potentially rich areas. So you could not tax pensioners or social workers, etc., in the middle of Shanghai at the mark-to-market rate and get away with it. It just was not possible. And if you didn't do that, you didn't raise any revenues. But if you make the linkage, again, this is work that we've done in parallel. And in the Chinese case, the goal is to raise at least 2% of GDP rather than 1.5%. Again, you get similar results. That it's inequality reducing, it raises revenue quickly, it's not subject to the cadastre, and it can be done in a way to anchor the municipal local government bond market, which was established without a base. So really, it's urgent and a key element in the restructuring. So concluding remarks is that, you know, if you're looking at managing risks and uncertainty in the multi-level country, you're going to have to coordinate investment decisions to make sure that the focus on weights on human, natural, and social capital are incorporated in the investment decisions and not in ex post facto transfers, which would be equivalent to Santiago Levy's good intentions, bad outcomes. And that market-based connectivity infrastructure without concern for emissions, congestion and pollution and the effects on the labor market in Chile, Mexico, China, and even in Italy lead to more and more congestion in the metropolitan areas. Then you need to think about ensuring workable earmark transfers, whether it's from higher levels of government or it's from the IMF or the World Bank in terms of the resilience and stability trust. How is that done? How is that implemented? And does it create the right incentives, or does it replace and create dependency? Then, of course, you need to make sure, and I think this is something which was right, you must have private finance, because public finance on its own is not going to do it. And therefore, if you have local government bond markets or PPPs, you're going to have own source local revenues for accountability and aligning incentives, plus full information. And this is hugely important for the IFIs, which have neglected the GFSM format That's the Government Financial Statistics Manual 2014, which is the economic components, leading components of the balance sheet, which are as important as the functional components. So as I said, if you just focus on the functions, you'll end up with greenwashing and without any idea about what is necessary in order to achieve sustainable outcomes. Then, of course, there's a huge amount of work that's needed on the implications of the new digital technologies in terms of rebalancing, in terms of revamping tax systems, revamping your treasury systems. Imagine with blockchain, your full information going to local governments, central governments, tax administration, and the treasury at the same time cuts out huge amount of paperwork that is currently necessary. So it's a huge opportunity to rationalize the structure of administration, but also the assignments. I think it's time to look again at the revenue assignments and also at the spending assignments, because again, if you just use subsidiarity and push everything down to the lowest level, and as you can see from the health crisis, that you needed coordination at higher levels, financing at higher levels, actually implementation at the local level. So you need to rethink how these assignments were or have been put in place or have been designed to be put in place. So I'll stop there, and I think I've taken just a little bit over 30 minutes, but apologize if it's a little more.
Muchas gracias, Ehtisham. Yo creo que te has ajustado perfectamente al tiempo y yo creo que ahora tenemos tiempo para la discusión. Has puesto sobre la mesa temas súper interesantes que yo creo que van a despertar algunas cuestiones o algunos debates, ¿no?, al respecto. Entonces, no sé si alguien quiere hacer alguna pregunta, algún comentario, a question. ¿Nadie? Bueno, yo quería hacerte, hasta que los participantes vayan pensando un poco, mientras van pensando en qué preguntarte. I will ask you in English question, or thinking about some thought that you mentioned at the end of the presentation, which is the digital economy, because, well, next generation funds are really focusing on that point. So I would like to know a little bit more about your opinion, because when I see that concept, like digital economy, I just think on acceptability. I mean, not only citizens, but also administration. Do you think that these kind of things are accepted by people easily, or useful for people, and also for the administration? Do you think that they can, not be very happy about these kind of things? So I would like to know your opinion about this digital economy.
That's a huge question. I think we could have a seminar on this, and it's also an area where there's quite a lot of work which is underway. Mm-hmm. And I think you can look at it at different levels. There's where it comes to interact with households, how people interact with the state, local governments, central government. It's also how governments interact with the private sector, for example. And I think one of the most interesting, let me start with a Chinese example. I think one of the most interesting experiments, and this is also relevant for the European Union, is in the creation of high-tech hubs. How do you create the high-tech hubs? And that's a question which I think we began to see the answers in the Mexican story, which was a simple, unified value-added tax, simple and unified value-added tax, that then made it possible to produce anywhere in the country and get refunds. So it didn't matter whether you were in a maquiladora zone or not. And that led to the huge influx of FDI outside the maquiladora zone. Admittedly in automobiles, which is likely to become a stranded sector, but it's the principle. But what the Chinese did was exactly the same. What the Mexicans did in 2013, the Chinese did in 2015, was to integrate the value-added tax and bring together the services component into the national VAT. By doing that, they remove the boundaries around Shenzhen, the special economic zone. So in a sense, what you have is a special economic zone, which remains with the agglomeration effect in Shenzhen, but able to transact with other agglomeration cities in Guangdong. So the idea of creating a high-tech zone, which is known as the Greater Bay Area, is to encourage R&D in Guangzhou, for example, which is the capital city. There are 109 micro medical research labs linked to the universities, 109 of them in Guangzhou. They then link with the companies that provide finance for startups from Shenzhen, and the linkages also with Hong Kong, Shanghai, and other 9 cities. You create a hub of R&D, of infrastructure, of finance, and then the value chain. I mean, this is just in the medical area, but that can be extrapolated into artificial intelligence, into half a dozen high-tech areas, and that's what they're creating. But it's a function of national investment, the national incentives creating a completely new type of special economic zone, completely new. So you do not need borders around a special economic zone. It's the agglomeration effects. So you completely change the nature of the special economic zone. And then you're providing the finance for the public sector. But you must also have the local public services to support this if you're not going to increase inequality too much. The Gini coefficient for Guangdong, which is the southern province of 110 million people, where all of this is taking place, is higher than that for China. So it's hugely unequal. So it's all along the coast, and this high-tech zone is on the coast, but it doesn't employ too many people. So it means that once you create this high-tech zone, traditional manufacturing can be sent elsewhere. And that's the rebalancing that they're doing. So that's the action on urban design, on industrial policy, which is a function of what they're doing on the high-tech. But if you take, for example, the implications of high-tech on, say, you've got blockchain and, say, property taxes. Each transaction is recorded. Information goes to the public sector, goes to private sector, it's public. Information at the same time goes to the central bank. Same time it goes to the State Administration of Taxation and the Ministry of Finance and the local government. So in a sense, what you have is immediate transmission of information, which completely transforms the treasury management system and the payment system. So you do not need the huge infrastructure which the IFIs have been putting in, myself included, for 30 years, based on the old technology. So there's a huge revolution in the possibilities of high tech. And that can be combined with low tech. And we would work with Giorgio in Tanzania on blockchain and, for example, satellite imagery. You want to identify the houses in Tanzania. Satellite imagery does that. You send graduate students to verify that there's someone living there. And then you have blockchain for the transactions. You completely transform the way you implement the beneficial property tax. And you can do it tomorrow in Tanzania. So really, if you're looking at a quick move to 1.5% of GDP for property taxes. In Latin America, Mexico is only 0.2 of 1% of GDP today. And most of that is in Mexico City. You have a problem, no? So that's the problem that needs to be addressed. It can be addressed very quickly, but it involves the use of this new technology. And you can even do it without the new technology if you keep it simple. You know, I think the point that Vito Tanzi emphasized again and again and again, keep it simple. Otherwise, you end up with complexity that then leads to, you know, rent-seeking behavior and corruption. So really, I think but there's a lot of work still to be done. I mean, what happens to assignments on the spending side? What's happened? There's been a lot of work, for example, in India and also in Africa, in direct payments through people's phones, even if you don't have a bank. If you have a, you know, a personal identifier number, there are issues about you know, information management and privacy that need to be addressed. So really, what we are seeing is a potential revolution in the way multi-level finance is organized and set up. And the point to keep in mind, and you know, this is very important. You know, we've all done, you know, the IFI's, you know, major enhancements in institutional reform, is not to look at this reform as an adjunct to what you're doing already. So if you have your current idea of what a tax administration should looks like today, and you're adding on blockchain as an add-on, it will go to nothing. You have to look at it in terms of a completely new vision of what it might look like down the road. And what it might look like down the road will be very different. You know, if you just, for example, looking at blockchain for, you know, managing the corporate income tax. Blockchain then does not require people sitting and watching the transactions in individual firms. That's done within the firm, and you want the interface of what's happening in the firm to be transmitted to the tax administration. So it completely eliminates a whole layer of administration, which, you know, it's at the moment there's a lot of money spent on those levels of administration. So the possibilities, same thing on trade. You know, with blockchain, you know, you can simplify your customs and tariff regimes. So, but it comes down to, again, you know, what sort of assignments are relevant, and that's a policy question. But you need to revisit it. And I think the focus, for example, in South Asia of pushing health and education down completely to subnational level without the financing has led to collapse in these basic functions. A, because they can't be done at that level. When you have a shock, you do need the finance and coordination at higher level. And secondly, that you know, this is not the way to do it even in the short run. So it means that one needs to rethink the way that the assignments have been propagated and popularized by the international agencies. And they're continuing to essentially propagate old technology and the normative model, which actually now doesn't even work in the United States. So I think there's a need to reconsider the way that, you know, public finances are managed in the US. I think, and rather than picking that up, and as we know that the whole positive literature arose because Europe was doing it differently, the assignments didn't match those in the US, but also when you start looking at China and other parts of the world, it's completely different. So pushing countries along the US, the old US model, in Latin America doesn't make any sense. So I think what works for Mexico is what will be consistent for public service delivery and efficient outcomes, looking at the incentives for people to migrate to the large metropolitan areas, Harris to Daro still works. People move to where the jobs are. So until the jobs are created in the South, which involves not only connectivity, but also local public services. So really, I think, the focus now with the Northern Triangle, which is the linkage between Chiapas and Tabasco with the Central American states to create jobs in that part of southern Mexico, I think is exactly right. It'll solve the problem for Mexico, but it also solves the problem of security for the Central American states. So I think there's a whole agenda there, which is cross-border as much as it is, what is necessary for Mexico. It's not the United States. It's what will work for Mexico. And, that needs to be thought through. And, the US type property model has not worked in Mexico. It hasn't worked, as far as I know, it hasn't worked in any country efficiently or sufficiently in either Asia or Latin America. So I think you're looking at a major work program. And what we had suggested both to the Chinese and to the Mexican authorities was a series of pilots. And both countries were about to start pilots, and then COVID hit. But I think we're now coming out of the immediate COVID crisis that prevents, the development pilot. I mean, you can do it quickly in one city, but you eventually have to link it to the overall structure for it to work efficiently. But you can try out a beneficial property tax locally in a way that you cannot do, for example, a value-added tax. The one thing about the value-added tax I'd like to add is that what the Mexicans did in the value-added tax in 2013 was to effectively drop the threshold to zero by integrating the small taxpayer regime with the large taxpayer regime, requiring small taxpayers to use electronic invoices. They gave free to the retail sector the electronic invoice packages. And, just a few months ago, there was a seminar where the CFO of Walmart said that because of that reform, we are able to interact with the Mexican retail sector for the nearshoring that's being discussed now, sort of moving activities from East Asia, which means China, to Latin America. It makes it easier for them to do that. And that other Latin American countries should also look at what the Mexicans did, which is the opposite of what the IMF tells them to do. They integrated the small scale sector with the large scale sector. And my colleagues in the IMF said, but the revenues that went up were large scale revenues. But that's exactly what you get, because the integration of the small taxpayers regime, repecos, with the normal regime stops the ability of the large taxpayers to hide transactions. So the tax GDP ratio went up 4 percentage points, largely because the large taxpayers couldn't use the small taxpayers as a way of hiding transactions. And the increase in revenues comes in the large taxpayers. But because you block the cheating through the small taxpayers, it's a very fine point. It's one that I wrote about there's a book the IMF published on informality. But the story is that you are using information management efficiently to address the revenue assignment question. And then splitting the revenue bases across levels of administration, the value-added tax makes no sense. I think Brazilian colleagues, Fernando, etc., have been working on this for ages. In South Asia, India has been trying to reverse the problems that it has created by having subnational VATs. Huge problems. Chinese and Mexicans have done the same thing and with similar results. So really, I think there's if you want to use new technology, you have to be looking at the whole policy framework and the institutional framework. Okay. And keeping the existing policies, existing institutions, and treating the new technology as an add-on makes no sense. It's going to be counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's a broad view. It's a very interesting view. I really think that we need to look at this, because every case is
It's
different.
hugely important. I think this is a research agenda that we're putting on the table, and the work that Giorgio and I have been doing on beneficial property taxes, I think, is part of it. It's not the whole thing, but you need to be looking at who does what, how it's financed, and then how shocks are incorporated. And then again, you need to be, as in the European Union, the work by Blanchard and Zettelmeier, led to a suspension on the fiscal rules. Now, Vito Tanzi, in the 1990s said that if you have a responsible government, you don't need fiscal rules. If you don't have a responsible government, fiscal rules don't work. I think that's basically right, but it means that you need to have some element of fiscal responsibility, which means redesigning the way the rules are put together. So it means a complete redesign, and I believe there's one underway and will be revealed by the European Commission either this week or the end of October. The proposal by Zettelmeier and Blanchard, with the structural, with the estimation of the structural imbalances, stochastic estimation, it's too complex for even a number of OECD countries. So really, I think you're looking at the need for something simple, but something flexible at a general government level. And I think the problem is that when you put a numerical rule at a subnational level, you restrict the ability of, and this is a mistake that the IMF has just made in the infrastructure volume. That means that poorer regions that actually need more infrastructure can't get it. And really what you need is a much tighter definition of accountability, which means the focus on own source revenues is central. And accountability, and then also having full information on what must be the responsibility of higher levels. So that you can have a fiscal rule for the country as a whole, maybe even a numerical one. But at the subnational level, it becomes very problematic. And that's something that, you're going to have to face in Spain and Italy and other of Europe as well. So this is a universal issue, as much as in Argentina or Mexico.
Yeah, that's true. It's everywhere. But, okay, I don't know if there's other questions or doubts or suggestions, comments. Because well, here there are many
experts. People left short. What is this guy saying? You're going to rethink, rethink multi-level finance.
No, but
I'm doing a book on rethinking.
I'm gonna switch into Spanish now. Yo sé que aquí en esta sesión hay muchos expertos en este tema, mucho más que yo, que seguro tienen alguna pregunta muy interesante que hacerle a Ehtisham. Respecto a cualquiera de las cuestiones que ha abordado. Sí, han levantado la mano María Dolores, que te acabo de ver ahora. Sí, a ver. Espera, que vamos a ver si...
¿Ahí me escuchan?
Sí, ahora sí.
Hola, Ehtisham, ¿cómo estás? Qué gusto.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
A los tiempos. Una pregunta muy cortita, bueno, no es tan corta. Como tú muy bien señalas, los gobiernos subnacionales tienen competencias que tienen incidencia en temas de cambio climático, tanto desde la parte de centralización administrativa, en la parte de ordenamiento territorial, etcétera, pero también ya focalizando en la descentralización fiscal y los desbalances que tenemos, porque muchas de las competencias de agua potable, de temas vinculados a gestión de riesgos de desastres, etcétera, tienen implicancias en cambio climático, ¿sí? Pero por el lado de las asignaciones de responsabilidades de ingresos, no tienen casi bases tributarias que les permitan solventar esto y crearías desbalances. México ha empezado a trabajar en lo que son impuestos al carbono subnacionales. que los llaman ecológicos. Hay otros países que han empezado a dar destinos específicos a las transferencias intergubernamentales para que destinen porcentajes a temas vinculados con reforestación, con conservación de áreas naturales, etc. ¿Cuál es tu opinión para cómo esto puede aportar o no, o si creamos más caos en la parte de descentralización fiscal al tratar de poner estos criterios climáticos en las relaciones fiscales intergubernamentales o darles potestades tributarias climáticas, o sea, de impuestos verdes? If you want, I can repeat in English.
No,
But I know that Ehtisham speak very well Spanish also. If you want, you can answer in English. Don't worry.
Gracias, Marián. No, I think you have a very important point here. The question really is, the extent of responsibility for a climate-related event that must fall at the local level. Supposing you have a hurricane or you have an earthquake. Clearly there is a need for not just support at the local level, but also from higher levels, and maybe international community. So what you're seeing now is a shock, which is a global shock, and a potential, I will say, a potential a debt crisis for many emerging market countries, including in Latin America. I think you're looking at, probably the worst debt crisis in Latin America since the 1990s coming, because, the effects of the interest rate hikes has not really fully worked out. So, there's a question of who does what, clearly at the very local level, making sure that you have drinking water, basic education and health is always local, that you provide food for those who, and also healthcare for those who have been affected by a hurricane or by an earthquake, or the climate crisis is just similar, only slow motion. Yeah, so it's the same sorts of issues which arise. So what must be done at the local level? Now, what must be done at the local level is the basic services, always. And that requires local financing in order for it not to become, something that gets left out. You see, if local governments rely entirely on, sort of going to Hacienda the end of May in Mexico, which is what tends to happen to get more money, which, in India used to be called, fiscal dentistry, gap-filling transfers, then everything else you do gets washed out. So the incentive structure is damaged by these types of transfers. Now, if you're giving earmark transfers, and indeed earmark transfers were envisaged for the HIPC. Initially, it was only debt relief. And when they gave the HIPC transfers, Jeff Sachs jumped up and down and said it's not getting to poor people. So HIPC 2 gave transfers to Bolivian municipalities for education and health, except that they couldn't do anything in education and health. What did Bolivian municipalities in 2003 do for education? Nada. They had the nominal responsibility, but the teachers were hired and were elements in the budget in La Paz. Infrastructure was done by the departamentos. Not clear who the liabilities were met by. So if all you did was, greenwashing the functions, which is what effectively HIPC 2 did, they greenwashed the function and said HIPC is giving money to education and health. Then, and Vicente, we had many discussions with Vicente following that Bolivia mission on, the design of charts of accounts in CIAFIs. So really what you need is full information. And with full information, also some ideas about, the effective control over the economic categories. And if you're talking about basic education and you don't control the teachers, you don't control anything. Now, in Mexico, teachers are largely financed with the transfer from the central government. Except the central government didn't know who the teachers were in 2013. They tried to run they had to arrest the leader of the teachers union in Mexico, a very rich multimillionaire lady. But they still couldn't do the test to find out whether the teachers could teach, whether they were actually teaching. So that's Mexico. So earmark money is coming down through states or directly to local governments, but they don't know where it's going or what the effects are. So under these circumstances, that's basic education, eh? And you multiply that to, by N for, forestry, for, transport, for electricity, et cetera, then you have, and you're only greenwashing the functions. You don't control the inputs. You have no idea what happens to the outputs. Useless. I mean, it's not wrong to greenwash. I mean, IDB is doing it. They've just published a book on, sort of taking function, sub-function, looking at green elements. But it's useless if you don't know what the components are or what the outcomes are. The outcomes may be unrelated to anything green. For example, the outcome in education is not necessarily education alone. Education is health, it's water supply, it's clean, schools, books, etc. So you got a whole bunch of functions that feed into one sub-function or one function. Then you've got the economic components, the full matrix. So you can't just green one element or just look at an outcome. You see, the other tendency, has been, in the international agencies has been to go the ratings approach. You forget about the inputs, just focus on the outcomes. That's not wrong. You do need to focus on the outcomes, but you also need the inputs. Otherwise, you have no way of linking what you're financing and what you're managing to the outcomes. So unfortunately, IFIs have really gone into a blind alley, including, the IMF. Apologize to my colleagues in the IMF, but this whole idea that you should still be sticking for public investment on market prices and subnational numerical fiscal rules, that's not going to give you green development. It's the opposite. That's the Chilean work that I did with Hernan Vizcarra. Vicente knows about that. He was still in the IDB. It was for his unit. I know they almost didn't publish it because it was the end of the Bachelet administration. But this SNE had asked for the reevaluation, and then of course with the change in administration, they lost interest. But I think they need to look at it again, and it needs now to be done on a systematic basis across the board, not just in Chile. So there is this book, there is this paper published by the IDB, which Hernan, sort of summarizes essentially the application of optimal taxation approaches to investment design, with weights on human, natural, social capital, and you look at different focuses on income groups and regions. So you're looking at the spatial dynamics at the same time as you're looking at your investment decisions. And clearly you get a multiplicity of options in doing this theory of reform approach to cost benefit analysis, to investment decisions, to financing decisions. But you need to look at it in the spatial context as to where you want to put your activities. What are you going to be producing? If what you're going to be producing in Chile is just copper and whatever else natural resources and financial sector activities, you're not going to be creating jobs. That's the political problem that Chile has faced. There are no jobs being created, in spite of the fact that they made a lot of money. So the UK has made a lot of money too. You know, the financial sector, London, wonderful. But there are no jobs in the Northeast, Midwest, Midlands. So that then leads to the political dissension that led, you know, contribute, not the only thing, but one of the contributing factors, no doubt, to Brexit. So, you know, the UK is in a mess because they still haven't worked out how they're going to do the rebalancing or the leveling up. And what Truss was trying to do was the opposite, which is create Singapore on Thames. You already have Singapore on Thames. It's called London. It doesn't create jobs. So that's a problem they're facing. So you don't create, you know, the textile industry is gone, automobiles is gone, you know, shipbuilding is gone. You know, there are no jobs for people in the Northeast and Northwest. So what are you going to be creating? And that's the story that every country needs to think through itself. But I think there is a story in southern Mexico and the Northern Triangle, which is a very interesting one, which is creating employment, and not just employment of people who are selling tacos on the street. I mean, the World Bank's been congratulating itself by saying that the number of self-employed people has gone up, but they're the people who have come from Mexico City are selling tacos. That's not creating jobs in Chiapas. That's not creating adequate jobs. It's not bringing in investment. And you need to bring in private investment, not public investment. So you need to lay the basis for private investment in Chiapas and Tabasco, and then link that to Central America. That's a huge, huge project. I think there's some work underway, which is quite interesting on you know, the Northern Triangle. But again, you know, I think what we have here is an agenda for work on theory linked to, you know, the problems we're facing. The problems we're facing are unprecedented. What do you do with the assignments under uncertainty and imperfect information? You've got uncertainty, you've got incomplete information. Those two are very difficult to handle in the existing models. So there's that work that has to be done. Then how do you link that to the policy work? There's some simple suggestions, you know, like on the VAT, which people have talked about, and Mexico has done, and the Chinese have done. And then, you know, whole design of these high-tech zones, fascinating story, but it's an extrapolation of what they did with the maquiladoras. They did attract investment for firms, brought in the firms, and then prevented Mexican workers from going into the United States, which is the idea behind the maquiladoras. Bring the firms rather than pushing the people into the United States. It worked to a large extent, but at a huge cost, inequalities. But there's a huge agenda, I think. Yeah, it's similar, you know, how do you make the next generation Euro work? You know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to prevent the outcomes from the 2008-10 crisis, because 2008-10 crisis led to a reinforcement of the existing imbalances in spite of the reform. So now hopefully the next generation Europe will address it, which means how do you get jobs into southern Italy or southern Spain? That's the issue. Not make it easier for them to go to Rome and Milan and Torino, which is where the jobs are. Anyway, that's a big agenda, and I hope that some of you will be interested in collaborating, because I'm still, you know, I think it's a big agenda that we can't just leave to the IFIs, because the IFIs are stuck in many ways with the normative US-centric models, because, you know, many of them have been to school in the US, they live in the US, and they think it works, but it doesn't even work in the US, to be honest.
Bueno, yo creo que tenemos tiempo para una pregunta muy corta. Si alguien más quiere hacer alguna cuestión, hacer alguna pregunta. Ya estamos muy cerca del tiempo.
Yes, I have a quick question. As always, Ehtisham, very provocative and with a vision for the medium and long term as well. If you need to sequencing the strategy for reform for multi-level financing, at some point you mentioned that it's probably easier to work on the expenditure side because there are more control of the variables. So what would be your suggestion in terms of sequencing some of the thought? Whether you start working on expenditure first and set up that multi-level responsibility of expenditure. Much more difficult perhaps is on the financing side.
I think you need to do both spending and revenue at the same time, but I think the sequencing issue is important. And our suggestion, and I think we can have a seminar with Giorgio in due course on this new book that should be out next week, is that you start at the local level because you can do it quite easily. And if you have the linkage between spending and revenues, existing small spending, water supply, local infrastructure, basic education, and property values. In the US, it works implicitly. If you're living in Scarsdale, you pay up to, I know my brother-in-law pays $140,000 a year property taxes for free Scarsdale High School, so his daughter can go to Harvard, which is where most of them go to, or Ivy League. But then you're paying $140,000 a year, as opposed to Washington, D.C. You live in Chevy Chase, I pay $8,000 a year. But so you see the differences. But implicitly, it's working in the US in a way that is very difficult in emerging markets. It doesn't. So really, and also to some extent, many people are seriously thinking that it doesn't even work in the US. Because look at the financing of the metro system. It's in a state of collapse. What was then used as the sort of co-financing by multiple regions of an infrastructure project. And there isn't adequate financing of the metro system in Washington, which used to be the example for mancomunidades in Latin America, if you recall. So the question is, how do you finance the infrastructure? And I think Biden has figured that out. It has to be central. You're not doing it locally. Much of the infrastructure now, you go down the street, etc., is being done by the federal grants. If you're getting federal grants, then what happens to local information and incentive structures, and that's the problem that is not so easy to handle. And that's a dependency question, which I think whether you're giving it to a country or you're giving it to a local government, incentive structures matter. Which is why the local own source revenue is absolutely central. You have to have a base. You can do a piggyback, for example, on the income taxes you do in the US. It's very easy to do. Why don't people do it? And you don't need a separate administration for that. And as we're looking now at the beneficial property tax, in the long run, it can be done very simply. Satellites in Bolivia, satellites, blockchain. You got it. And just graduate students verifying, where people are. The blockchain is necessary on property sales. Really. To make it run on the annual tax, you don't even need blockchain. Just need to know the area of a property location. Let the local government decide on the marginal rate. And you have your own source revenue. Should be the own source main local own source revenue. It doesn't exist in Latin America. UK gets 3.5% of GDP. Simple tax like this. They moved away. UK moved away from the ownership valuation tax system. Margaret Thatcher found that half of London is owned by one man, and his ancestors stole it in 1066, the Duke of Westminster. So she just forget it. When she went for the poll tax and cost her a job, which is hugely regressive. And I think the system they have now, not perfect, but you can raise 3.5% of GDP. You're doing okay. I mean, get 2%, you're doing fine in Latin America. Then you've got the basis for PPPs. You've got the basis for efficient bond markets to finance the local infrastructure. Then you need to have a equalization system for current transfers, not actuals. And you need clearly defined, as Maria Dolores was saying, special purpose transfers that you can actually monitor. No point having a special purpose transfer to a function like education or primary education. You don't have the teachers in that. What use is that? And look at the work being done at IDB to, sort of tag function, sub-function, sub-function, green or not green. Just complexity in a chart of accounts that you don't actually have. It's pointless.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry for being a bit down on your ex-colleagues, but we should carry on this discussion maybe over coffee next week.
Sí, yo creo que como los dos estáis en Washington, yo creo que podéis continuar la discusión delante de un café tranquilamente.
We'll certainly do it.
Sí, sí. Nosotros tenemos que acabar un poquito aquí porque ya nos pasamos algo del tiempo. Entonces, pues no sé si Javier quería comentar algo. Muchas gracias, Ehtisham, por tu presentación, por animarnos a discutir y hablar de estos temas. Y bueno, creo que Javier estaba queriendo decir algo para terminar.
No, yo solo quiero. Claro, con Ehtisham tenemos un problema. Tenemos un problema en AIFIL, que es que es uno de nuestros más activos miembros del comité honorario. Y el problema es que nos pone deberes. Nos pone deberes. Llega una, se la acumula de hoy y nos ha abierto la agenda para todo el año. Tenemos un montón de hilos por los que tirar y cosas por las que trabajar, ¿no? Por lo tanto, bueno, pues yo agradezco especialmente a Ehtisham que haya querido acompañarnos hoy con esta magnífica presentación. Para mi gusto, demasiado abierta, con lo cual lo que yo digo, tenemos demasiado campo para explorar para el futuro y seguro que dentro de estos seminarios, de este plan de seminarios que tenemos para el año, volveremos sobre estos temas sin duda, sobre estos y algunos otros temas. Ahí hemos hablado de muchas cosas, de cambio climático, de urbanización, de impuestos sobre la propiedad, de transferencias intergubernamentales, de créditos, de inversiones, en fin, cada cosa nos da para tirar de muchísimos hilos y para hacer muchas cosas. Entonces, bueno, gracias Ehtisham por tu participación, gracias por abrirnos campos de trabajo y por ponernos deberes, en todo caso, para la asociación en los próximos tiempos.
Muchas gracias a todos. Hasta luego.
Muy bien.